from the studios of Postscript Media and Canary Media.
For decades, we have wildly underestimated the growth of renewables. This is a well-known problem in energy circles. There's this wide gap in growth projections from analysts who are focused on trends in renewables and the energy modelers at institutions like the International Energy Agency or the U.S. Energy Information Administration. And I saw this really early in my career when the Sierra Club issued a 2007 report showing explosive growth for solar through 2020. And the technology barely registered on other forecasts. And there were plenty of people who were skeptical of an environmental group putting out solar projections. But in fact, the Sierra Club numbers turned out to be really conservative. And this is played out in lots of different ways. Ramez Nam noticed this phenomenon a few years later in 2011 as he started mapping the cost curve of renewables.
And at the time, the IEA, National Energy Agency, had a forecast for solar costs, said the cost of solar electricity would drop by about in half from 2010 to 2050.
Now, to put that in perspective, the cost per watt of solar panels and the cost of generated solar electricity fell by 90% in a decade. Dick Swanson, the founder of SunPower, predicted this trend in 2006 as he looked at historic trends in the semiconductor industry, and Ramez and others saw the same thing.
I came from tech, where we have Moore's Law, and so I just applied the very same sort of very dumb learning model to solar. And because I didn't know enough about energy to know how I was going to be wrong, it worked, more or less. So my forecast was the cost of solar would drop by about a factor of 10 to 2050, and it actually dropped twice as fast as I thought it would.
Ramez is a technologist who studies trends in decarbonization. This is him on stage in Seattle at a recent Canary Media Live event talking with journalist David Roberts. And the cost curve, he says, is still headed downward.
Will it keep getting cheap? The future is uncertain, but the odds are yes. So my personal forecast is the cost of solar electricity will drop by about another factor of 4 by the time solar is about a third of all electricity generation on Earth.
Now, many of the traditional modeling agencies have changed the way they analyze renewables, but the trends are still taking a lot of people by surprise, particularly those who are operating infrastructure. Back in February, we made an episode about how 99% of coal plants in America are more expensive to operate than new renewables. And Ramez looks at this and says it clearly marks a new phase for the build-out of wind, solar, and batteries.
Clean electricity, especially solar, and now batteries have gone through. They're entering their third phase. The first phase was all of history from the 1970s to 2010, 2015. They were in their first phase that was totally uncompetitive, totally policy dependent. Then with a second phase where new electricity from solar and wind became cheaper in some parts of the world than building new power from gas and coal, at least during the hours the sun shone or that the wind did. And that's their second phase, cost competitive. And now they're into their third phase. The cost just on a pure kilowatt hour basis of electricity from new solar, new wind would be cheaper than the operational cost of an already built coal or gas power plant. And that's happening.
This era has only begun, and it's challenging the economics of conventional generation in markets around the world.
I do think there's lots of reasons, not in every single clean tech, but in those, and the ones we make in factories, mass produce in high volumes, that those will have a very, very rapid learning rate for decades to come.
This is The Carbon Copy. I'm Stephen Lacey. This week, a conversation between journalist David Roberts and futurist Ramez Nam about what's ahead in the energy transition. This podcast is brought to you by CorePower, an American manufacturer of battery cells for electric vehicles and stationary storage. CorePower founder and CEO Lindsay Gorel is a former executive in the mining industry, and he's now devoting his career to building U.S. industrial capacity in clean energy.
Yeah, I can tell you it's a lot of stress to build a company, but I think personally, it's just the ability to build something that I believe we need.
Stay with us to the end of the show. We'll have an interview with Lindsay about CorePower's gigawatt-scale battery facility underway in Arizona. The Carbon Copy is supported by Fish Tank PR. In this turbulent and exciting energy transition, your approach to communicating with journalists, investors, and customers must evolve. Whether you need to position yourself as a thought leader in between project announcements or translate complex ideas and technologies into tangible, compelling content, Fish Tank can help. To learn more about Fish Tank's approach, visit Fish Tank PR. That's FISCH Tank PR. And if you're looking for your next role in PR or media relations, check out Fish Tank's open job listings. The Carbon Copy is brought to you by Savant. No home can be truly smart without smart power. Savant Power Systems let you monitor, store, and control your home's energy, putting the power to live comfortably and sustainably in your hands. The award-winning Savant app tracks real-time energy production to enable maximum efficiency during blackouts and peak energy pricing periods. The Savant Power System. Focus your energy. Learn more at savant.com, SAVANT, savant.com. In late June, our partners at Canary Media hosted a live event at KEXP in Seattle. And the estimable journalist David Roberts was there recording a live conversation with Ramez Nam for his podcast, Volts. Both of these guys are very well versed in a wide array of decarbonization topics. David has been covering this space for a couple of decades. He runs the newsletter Volts and the podcast Volts, and he's an editor at large at Canary Media. And Ramez has been focused on this space for over a decade. He came to climate tech with a background in technology and science fiction. And in this interview, both of these guys cover a lot of ground, from the competitiveness of wind, solar, and EVs, to grid modernization, to space-based solar, to geoengineering. And we're going to play an edited version of that conversation for you now. So here it is. They started with the role of renewables in an electrified economy.
One of the big questions about the electrify everything model is wind and solar variable. Even with batteries, the batteries we have today, you can get 2, 4, maybe 6, 8 hours out of lithium-ion batteries, but you still have variability to deal with. And so there's this idea that sort of you're going to get to, depending on who you ask, 60, 70, 80, 90%, and you're going to have to fill in the remainder with something else. And it seems to me, whether that's 60% or 90%, depends a lot on just how cheap solar and wind get. So I guess what I'd like to ask is, how far do you think electrify everything is going to go? Do you think these learning curves are going to be so far and so fast that we're going to end up needing less of that supplemental stuff than is currently forecast?
Yeah, I think it varies on a variety of things. It varies on geography. So for instance, Europe is harder to power with renewables than the US is, because the US has more sunshine and solar gets cheap the fastest. Europe has Europe or Japan or Taiwan or South Korea are these places that have winter peaking systems and don't have a lot of sun. So they're more dependent on wind, doesn't get cheap as fast. It also matters how big the grid is. Like if we built a Chinese scale grid in the US, you could have solar going from New Mexico to New York. You could have wind from the Great Plains going out to the coast. But if we don't get transmission built, and right now we're sucking at building transmission in the US, then like powering New York in winter is actually really hard. So those are like big variables. And in general, I have my opinions on what I think is going to get cheap the fastest, but I'm in general a believer in like, let's have more tools in the toolkit than we think we need, because some of them are not going to pan out in certain areas. So let's invest in all of it. Let's invest in small modular reactor, nuclear fusion, transmission grids, ultra long duration energy storage, power to hydrogen. Let's do all of it and like be in a situation where we have more tools than we need rather than fewer.
All right, you're doing the all the above cop-outs. I'm going to put you on this. So you have solar, wind, and battery. You have your variable core, and then you have your supplements to even out the power, smooth out the power.
Yeah.
Right now, what's going to occupy that role, that supplemental role, is up in the air. Could be it could be a lot more storage. It could be, as you say, a lot more transmission. It could be some sort of clean, firm power like geothermal or small nukes. It could be small natural gas plants with CCS, which is what you see in the models. In the big models, they have truckloads of natural gas with CCS, all playing the same basic role, which is evening out the variability of renewable energy. So I want to know, yes, we want to invest in everything. Yes, we want to pursue everything. Yes, we want to keep our options open. But in your opinion, what is the mix that's going to play that role?
The most underrated of those technologies is super long duration transmission. That is probably the one that we don't invest in.
Long distance, you mean?
Ultra long distance, like coast to coast, continent-scale transmission. It's probably the one that has the best upside and the most certainty that we can do it, but it's blocked not by economics, not by technology, but by permitting, fundamentally, and we're not doing a lot on there. I think clean firm, whether you call it nuclear fission, SMR fission, fusion, geothermal everywhere, ultra-deep geothermal can get power any place on the Earth, has a big role to play. Ultra-long duration storage is a wild card. Like 12-hour storage, I'm convinced, is that's going to be solved. But in Europe, or on the US East Coast, you need weeks or months of storage.
Right.
And we don't, there's a few technologies that might do that, but they're wild cards right now. I think offshore wind has a huge role to play, and floating offshore wind is one of the most underrated technologies, because in deep water, you basically can't do bottom-out offshore wind. So around Japan or the US West Coast, I think floating offshore wind is probably also a massively underrated technology. And then my very favorite total wild card in these that nobody believes in really but me is space-based solar.
I knew it.
And that one, my friend Greg Mariniak's been talking about space-based solar for a decade, and I'd be like, no, Greg. 20% of the Earth's land area is desert. Like, space launch costs so much. Why would we ever do this? But in space, there's no clouds. You can just have it. You can get 24/7 power. You can beam it to Earth with microwaves that penetrate clouds and rain. And some models show it getting in at 2 or 3 cents a kilowatt hour, based on things like how cheap Starship is going to make launch cost, we think.
Right, and isn't space is getting cheaper, right? Getting up to space is rapidly getting cheaper.
Space launch is getting cheaper faster than solar. Only 2 things in history have gotten cheap faster than solar to date, which are computing and gene sequencing or gene printing. But right now, we're in a phase where the cost of space launch is actually dropping faster than the cost of solar. And so and then you have this other advantage: you beam power back to Earth in microwaves. There's a variety of challenges of it, let me tell you. There's a lot of challenges. But if you beam it down at the same intensity as sunlight, your antennas are 3 or 4 times as efficient. So you get 4 times the power per the same land area, and it works in winter. So that's my personal wild card. There's 6 startups in the whole world doing it. But I'm actually looking.
Has there been solar power transmitted to Earth from space?
No.
Has it actually happened?
No, and there's various problems with it. So we've had the first experiments of transmitting. We have lots of solar in space for satellites, and we have the first experiments happening for transmitting solar from one satellite to another. But the big problem, so there's some startups that are using lasers. Lasers are BS, because lasers don't penetrate clouds and rain, so why would you do it? It doesn't matter. But one of them just raised a bunch of money, whatever. The way to actually do it is microwaves. But the problem with microwaves is if you want to hit a target on Earth, you need these kilometer-square arrays in space, and no one's ever built anything of that size in space. So if you want sci-fi, and I know some sci-fi,
and do you
that's
fry
totally
the birds?
Sci-fi.
Do you fry the birds?
You can transmit it. I mean, you could if you were really good.
If you wanted to.
No one can get that good. No one can get that good at beaming microwaves yet. But you could transmit it at 1 sunlight intensity, but get 3 or 4 times the energy on the ground in the same area. So getting to where you can fry birds is actually a really, really hard problem. It's not the problem that we have right now.
Interesting. And this brings up my lonely wild card, since you were talking about lonely wild cards, the one that only I seem to care about, which is wireless charging of electrical devices, which I always thought conceptually solves all kinds of problems. I can just imagine, power transmitters seeded throughout your city, and every electrical device having a receiver able to receive power through the air. I mean, those technologies exist. You can power something at a distance. Now, even at a reasonably large distance, there are sonar versions, laser versions, there's weird X-ray versions. And I just thought, cut the cord, all these charging difficulties go away. Basically, everything electrical is charging all the time. When I do my little, the future meme, the future world we're going to have meme, it's all wireless charging. Do you have an eye on that? Is anything happening there? Do you think that's going to go anywhere?
I have a little bit of an eye on that, but it still doesn't solve a lot of the problems, because it's really hard to do super long distance. Again, unless you build these, if you want to penetrate clouds anyway, unless you build these kilometer square transmitters. So I think for a short range, within our room, there are potential, or maybe for mountaintop to mountaintop, but getting it across a continent without bouncing it in space is really hard, I think.
All right. And you are in tech, really, and not really in politics, but I'm curious what your take is on, I wouldn't say that IRA has taken care of the funding problem. I mean, I think we still need a lot more funding for everything all the time, everywhere. But there's a huge accelerant now, at least in terms of money. So what do you see then when you think about the U.S. Decarbonizing?
Yeah.
What are the big remaining barriers that worry you?
It's a really good question. I'd say like the IRA is just part of the puzzle. Like the IRA, it's interesting. The IRA is understated. It's not $450 billion of federal spending a year. It's like trillions, because the IRA is not a pool of money. It's a per unit subsidy. And forecasters always do what? On unit forecasts, they always underestimate it, right? So the actual size of the IRA is actually much larger. And at the
I
same
think
time,
Goldman Sachs said 1.3 trillion, I think was its number, as opposed to the official number, which was 3.9 billion.
300 and some billion or 40
Yeah,
billion.
300 something billion, but a lot more than the official forecast.
Yeah, and I'd say the IRA also, like we talk a lot about the US, but let's think about this globally. Like three big things happening in global climate policy over the last few years. China has further put its foot on the accelerator. India's done some, but I don't even count that. Vladimir Putin invading Ukraine. Putin is like now a climate hero. I mean, he's an asshole, but he's done all this work because we thought natural gas was going to be the last fossil fuel we got off of, and Putin thought, the natural gas exports to Europe, he had Europe over a barrel. But instead, he's accelerated the pace at which Europe is getting off of gas, deploying more renewables, ultra long duration storage, hydrogen, funding fusion, all this stuff. So those are equally big, and the IRA is really big. What is the IRA not? And by the way, in the U.S., we talk about the IRA. We don't talk enough about state-level policies. 29 states in the U.S. have a binding RPS or CES, right? And that started before the IRA, and it's actually potentially been even more impactful. What does the IRA not solve? It doesn't solve permitting. And that's actually like the Achilles heel that we have. And when we talk about permitting, like if there's a strain of environmentalism that is like, don't build it environmentalism, and that's gonna kill us. Like that's the biggest political barrier we have in the US is that it's so dang hard to build things. And people talk about NEPA reform, whatever. NEPA is just the feds. Like if you want to build something, it's this internested issue of multiple federal agencies and then multiple states and then county level and city level and every property owner. We just had the first interstate transmission line in the US, the biggest one, approved like 2 months ago, I think, Arizona to California. Yeah, I think it's an $8 billion project. Okay, we spent trillions, right? That $8 billion project took 18 years to get approval from multiple states, multiple counties, landowners, and so on. If that's the pace, we're just in a world of hurt. So what do I think? The most important thing we can do in policy in the US is get out of the way and allow stuff to be built. NIMBY is like the death of the world if we don't stop it.
Yeah. This is going to be an interesting internecine tension. I think there's a great article in Heat Map about it just this week. Everybody should be reading Heat Map. It was about this, and I wrote not to.
Eric has an opinion on that.
After you're done with Canary, you should read Heat Map. And I, not to toot my own horn, but I wrote about this back in 2012 or whatever. But this distinction between climate hawks and environmentalists is how I put it. People who are primarily focused on decarbonization, people who are primarily coming out of the environmental movement with all its sort of associated commitments and whatnot. And I think this is going to be a huge tension, but it's also, do you worry at all? Maybe you don't worry, I worry about a lot of the people who are yelling about permitting want to cut down environmental review because they don't care about the environment and want more oil and gas and don't, this is all bad faith from one large portion of this debate. Do you worry about being on the same side with a bunch of bad faith jerk-offs?
I think the bad faith actors, the actors that want like permitting reform so they can build more fossil fuels, are on the losing side of history. They're betting on a technology that fundamentally is going to lose on cost. So I say let it come. Like in an open playing field, if it's easier to build pipelines and transmission lines, clean electricity is going to win. So I'm totally happy taking that deal. Bernie Sanders disagrees, right? Like he voted against the Schumer-Manchin permitting reform bill that you had one Republican vote for because he's so obsessed, as a sustainable environmentalist, obsessed with don't build fossil fuels. Well, guess what? Building more renewables is actually more important than not building fossil fuel infrastructure. On a competitive basis, it's at least my bet, the clean energy just wins on cost. So open the floodgates, let it in, and clean energy is going to win, is my personal viewpoint on this.
What do you make of this? This just came out, another version of information that's come out over and over again over the years, which just shows that fossil fuels are not declining. Globally, they're not declining. We are adding on to the total energy load of the world. That's what renewables are doing, is increasing the total, but the actual amount of fossil fuels is not declining, which leads a lot of people to say building new renewables is not enough. We have to cut off supply at some point. What do you make of that argument?
So I think you got to look at leading indicators and trailing indicators. And the leading indicator is cost. What's going to win economically? And then the second, the next indicator, the next derivative is pace of deployment increase, and then actual deployment and actual deployed stocks is a super trailing indicator. So you look at this, and are we growing renewables fast enough now? Are they undoing fossil fuels? Well, actually, we might have passed peak fossil fuels in the power sector in 2022. All the growth, we have not yet shrunk the internal combustion engine car fleet, but what was anybody want to guess, what's the year in which we sell more, in which sales of gasoline-powered cars peaks? Anybody have a guess? 2017, 2018. It happened already. Now, we wanted to go down faster. We want retirements of ICEs cars to be faster than deployments, but all the growth in vehicles and passenger vehicles is electric. So have we peaked yet? No, and I think we'll hit peak total fossil fuels and peak emissions sometime later in this decade, towards 2030. It's not fast enough, but the writing is on the wall. Fossil fuels are primarily dead men walking. It's just a matter of how fast can we pull it off.
The Carbon Copy is supported by Fish Tank PR, a media relations and corporate comms agency dedicated to elevating the work of both early-stage and established companies across clean tech, including EV infrastructure, solar plus storage, grid edge tech, software, renewable energy project development, financing, and more. When you're looking for a PR firm, not many of them discuss transparently what drives results. Fish Tank has been in the clean tech industry for more than a decade and is able to use deep expertise to simplify messaging, collaborate effectively with clients, and consistently engage journalists. To learn more about Fish Tank's approach to clean tech and the services they offer, visit Fish Tank PR. That's FISCH Tank PR. And if you're looking for your next role, check out Fish Tank's job openings. The Carbon Copy is brought to you by Savant. With the launch of its intelligent power system, Savant is redefining what it means to own a truly smart home. The new Savant power system features the ability to monitor, store, and control electricity from the grid and solar to optimize everyday energy efficiency, offset peak utility costs, or maximize stored power to keep your family comfortable and safe during grid outages. The award-winning Savant app displays your energy production and consumption in real time and allows for easy-to-use control and hands-free automation. Plus, the system's scalable design means you can start small and expand as your needs change. When you're in control of your home's energy, the power to save on energy costs while protecting the environment, it's in your hands. The Savant Power System. Focus your energy. Learn more at savant.com, S-A-V-A-N-T, savant.com.
So let's talk then about the hard to abate sectors then, because they're the ones, I think we can, I wouldn't say we have electricity in hand, but we have a sight line to where we're going on electricity. We have a sight line where we're going on transportation. We have a sight line in buildings, although this crowd is full of people who will tell us all about the many complications of doing what we know how to do in buildings, but we know how to do what we need to do in buildings. But there are these legendary, difficult to decarbonize sectors. So two questions. One is, do you think they still warrant that term? Do you think they're still difficult to decarbonize? And which of those worry you?
Yeah, they are. And so I should say that what I've been saying is mostly related to power and ground transport. That's where we have really, really fast learning rates. But if you add up ground transport and power, you've got maybe 45% of global carbon emissions, right? The really big ones are industrial emissions, or who talked about cement. My math is more like 6-7% of emissions. Steel is another 7 or 8. But like industrial emissions are really hard, and it's not clear that the learning rates will be as fast as our renewables. So that is a big problem. That said, like I wrote a piece for TechCrunch in 2018 or something where I was really worried about this, and we've made more progress faster on industrial emissions than I expected those 4 or 5 years ago. So are we going to go fast enough? I don't know, but we're moving that needle. And then the other one that's hard and big, people talk about aviation. Steel is 4 times as big as aviation, right? Like aviation we will solve eventually, but steel and cement are really big ones. But the other one that's really hard is agriculture, forestry, and land use. Cows and deforestation. Mm-hmm. And that one's not growing, really, but it's about a quarter of all emissions. It's bigger than industrial emissions. It rivals electricity. And that's going to take a mix of just pure policy work to protect land and finding a way to feed the world's appetite for meat, which is just going to go up. Like, forget about reducing meat consumption. It ain't going to happen. Meat consumption is going to keep going like this and this. So we've got to find ways to produce that meat, or something that people think is meat, at a way that's cost. And I'm actually not that bullish on alternative proteins either. I think it's got to be like, mostly it's going to be fields, like where we grow corn and soy and so on today, and wheat and animal agriculture is my guess. We've got to find a way with a cost perspective to reduce that cost, reduce the emissions, of things like fertilizer, that might be 6 or 7% of emissions, and protect land from being converted from forest or wetlands into crops or grazing land. And that one, cows and steel and cement keep me up more than electricity and cars.
So what is happening in steel? Like you say, we're making more progress than you thought. What is the solution that you?
Yeah, I mean, I think with steel, the most likely solution is power to hydrogen. Like a lot of the steel emissions. So for recycled steel, increasingly we use electric arc furnaces. You can power them with renewables. But for primary steel, we use coal as a reducing agent. Iron ore has oxygen on it. You've got to strip the oxygen off. So we're using the coal. You can bust the coal, you get carbon monoxide, it binds with oxygen and strips it off. It's a reducing agent. So you can use hydrogen for that. And hydrogen does look like it's going to have a sharp reduction. It's not the only bet. There's other bets. I think Breakthrough invested in a company that does a form of electrolysis to extract pig iron or pure iron ore from or pure iron that you can use to make steel from iron ore. So there are multiple technology pathways in each of these, but right now hydrogen looks like the best bet, I'd say, for steel.
Well, let's talk about hydrogen for a second then, because this is like, as Amy said earlier, hydrogen is on everybody's tip of everybody's tongue. It's the next belle of the ball. Everyone loves it. Everyone thinks it's going to do everything, and you can technically do everything with it if you wanted to. So how, this gets back a little to one of my original questions, which is how far electrification is going to go and how much you're going to need other stuff.
Yeah.
How big of a role do you see hydrogen playing in the final analysis?
Hydrogen could be enormous. It could be that we build as much power gen, as much renewables to produce green hydrogen as we do for direct power into buildings and electric vehicles and so on. We'll see. I think there's things where hydrogen is not the solution, as we mentioned earlier, like hydrogen-powered cars and trucks. Forget about it. That's been clear for a decade. That's not going to be cost-competitive electrification.
You saw the Toyota guy now, this poor Toyota guy.
So out to lunch. Like they're so good on hybrids, and they just totally missed the boat on electrification.
He's out now doing sort of the falling on his sword thing, apologizing to everyone, and it's clear.
It's a little late
for anybody who doesn't know what we're talking about. The Toyotas. It was one executive. I think it was like the legendary longtime head of Toyota was like, electricity, ishmectricity. It's going to be hydrogen fuel cells, and just clung to that. And after.
Yeah. And that was a uniquely Japanese thing. Like Japan as a country has made some interesting, on paper bets on hydrogen that just don't make any sense. Importing hydrogen across oceans hydrogen's so hard to move. It's like
mixing hydrogen into your natural gas in your natural gas pipelines.
Yeah, that might work for just distribution of the hydrogen, pipelines are the only cheap way we know of to move hydrogen today, or using the hydrogen to make steel, for instance, that you then ship around the world. But hydrogen for like building heat doesn't make any sense. Hydrogen for cars doesn't make any sense. But hydrogen makes a ton of sense for steel making, maybe for high temperature industrial heat. Hydrogen makes a ton of sense as an ingredient to make electrofuels you can put in existing ships and planes, whether that's ammonia or a drop-in kerosene. We'll probably never make hydrogen-powered planes. They don't make any sense. But making a drop-in fuel from hydrogen that you can burn in existing Boeings and Airbuses does potentially make sense. So it has, and hydrogen for green fertilizer. Fertilizer is already like, I don't know, $70, $80 billion market for hydrogen goes into, methane-based hydrogen for fertilizer around the world today. So that's already like an enormous market that once hydrogen gets cheap enough, it has various access to.
Yeah, everybody should listen to the pod I just released this morning, I think. I'm not sure when this will come out, so this won't mean anything to listeners, but my last pod, a guy whose business model is off-grid renewables feeding directly into electrolyzers, making green hydrogen, which then go directly into methanol. They're starting with methanol for ships. None of it's connected to the grid. No pipelines coming in or out. The only thing that comes out of the whole thing is trucks full of methanol. It's a really interesting
It
new
makes
area.
a ton of sense. It's way easier to move hydrogen as a product that's not hydrogen than it's hydrogen itself.
Right. That was his calculation. His calculation was it's really difficult to move hydrogen, and it's really difficult these days to move electricity.
Yeah.
So let's move the methanol. Let's make methanol and move it.
I will say was that the policy details about hydrogen were mentioned in the earlier panel, and there's a big policy fight right now of what gets counted as clean electricity for hydrogen, and there's every chance we're going to screw it up, and that the IRA is going to be interpreted by Treasury, that actually controls who gets the tax credit, to just let you buy grid electricity and unbundle directs, which are kind of BS, as a way to call your hydrogen green. And if that's the case, it's going to set us back for a while. And we'll see how Treasury rules, but it's not looking that pretty.
Although it's worth saying that it says, not to get into this whole thing, but it says in the statute that the hydrogen subsidies must reduce emissions. So if they do it that way, it won't reduce emissions. So I don't see how they get around that very plain statutory language, although I'm sure if they tried hard enough.
I'd love to be wrong. I hope that you're right.
And another big battle going on around hydrogen that's maybe just worth calling out is natural gas companies that are dying, looking at obsolescence, flailing about for some reason to stay alive, are now talking about mixing hydrogen in with natural gas to lower the greenhouse gas intensity of the natural gas, which is just somebody compared it to pouring champagne in your municipal water supply or something like that. Just the most ludicrous use of hydrogen possible. But there's a lot of money, lot of money behind that one now. So hydrogen, a lot of opportunities for shenanigans around hydrogen. I want to ask a bigger theoretical question, because this is one of my favorite things to talk about, and I'm never sure how seriously I take it. I'm never sure how serious I am about it. But when you look forward at the solar cost curve, it was ludicrously optimistic back in 2011. If you just do the same thing today, once again, like 10 years out, it's just ludicrously cheap. It's just cheap beyond anything anybody knows how to process today. Wind too and batteries too, but mainly solar. And so, as you had a great chart about batteries, which just made the point that as they get cheaper, you find more uses for them. And as you find more uses for them, they build more and they scale up and they get cheaper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Same for solar. As it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, it's just going to be possible to put it everywhere, on everything, all the time. And so you can see in the distant future, but our lifetimes, I think, a society in which power is ubiquitous and to coin a phrase, too cheap to meter. Is that going to happen?
I think we'll always have a reason to pay for it, and we'll just appetite as the cost goes down, appetite might go up. I mean, you look at other things like the cost of lighting has dropped by a factor of 500 over the last century, right? And that's a combination of power getting cheaper, like the way that we produce lighting getting cheaper, and efficiency, LEDs. So will the cost of power drop? Eventually it will. I think that what you're going to see is right now the grid investment is sapping up most of the reduction in cost of renewables. And the cost differential of power across time and space is going to change. What I mean by that is like today, power costs do fluctuate by season and by location, but fossil fuel costs vary less. Whereas in the future, what you're going to find is like, how do you power stuff in winter, especially in a place far away from the equator? So the power cost average across the year might be cheaper, but in January, like in the UK, in London, you get 1/7 as much power from solar panels in January as you do in June or July. So that means that the cost of power from solar, at least, is going to be ludicrously high in winter. And guess what? UK energy use or Germany's peaks in winter. So I think you might find much cheaper power in certain times and places, but not as much in northern latitudes in winter. And that's going to cause funky things in sort of our power pricing. That having been said, like I think there's every reason to believe that in the long run, energy is going to be cheaper for people than it is today, certainly as a proportion of income.
Yeah, I guess I just wonder if you ever can imagine it becoming cheap enough and ubiquitous enough that we get to something like elevated global standards of living and fully autonomous luxury communism or whatever you call it.
Maybe. I mean, we're getting more elevated standards of living around the world today, right? People don't know this, but global inequality peaked in the 1970s and has been dropping since then. If you compare, countries around the world and not just within one country, poverty has, dropped massively. So the number of people on Earth that don't have electricity access has dropped materially in the last 10 or 20 years. The number of people without access to clean water and food has dropped a lot. In China and India, less so sub-Saharan Africa. So we are gradually increasing global abundance. Are we going fast enough? No, but it's happening. And I think there's every reason to believe that it will continue to happen.
So let's talk about fast enough then, because obviously the counterweight to fully automated luxury communism is climate dystopia. Who knows how those might balance out? What fun, we'll all find out.
It's good for science fiction.
Yeah. So I think it's clear, though, that even with all the good news these days and all the momentum behind clean energy and I think growing momentum, you could say, it looks pretty clear that we're not going to hit our 1.5 degree target that we all agreed on in the UN, not at least through the replacement of fossil fuels with clean energy alone. So, I think that's, people say that a lot, and then there's a sad trombone and everybody's sad for a while and then we move on. But it seems like that's important and we should be thinking about what that means, what to do with that information, what we should do. Are there emergency, pull handle if emergency type things we should be doing when we think about avoiding 1.5 or trying to keep to 1.5 or compensating for not hitting for 1.5. So how do you think about sort of, if you think of the energy world as kind of going the right direction but not fast enough, what do you do about the rise in temperature in the meantime?
It's a great question. Just to put some numbers around that. When you and I both sort of got into this field, 2011, let's say, we thought the world was headed for 4, 5, or 6 degrees Celsius of warming. And that's the difference between now and the middle of the last ice age. That is truly the stuff of nightmares. That is agriculture would fail in various large parts of the world. Probably not an extinction level event, but maybe the end of human society in certain ways.
Yes, I never forget Kevin Anderson's quote, 4 degrees is incompatible with organized global society.
It ain't good, right? So the good news is we have very likely canceled that apocalypse. If you look at what's happened now, just in the last 24 months, we had a raft of papers saying The most recent one says the most likely outcome. There's climate dice, there's probability distributions, there's lots of unknowns in this. But the most likely outcomes now are, I think the most recent paper said 2.1 and 2.4 degrees Celsius of warming. And so the good news is, like, we should all celebrate that for a while, because that is a level of temperature that is actually compatible with the world overall growing richer. Okay, like that is we've canceled. Like, it's no longer going to be, what's the movie where you have like a new ice age come in, whatever. Any of these.
Day after tomorrow.
Day after tomorrow. We're probably not headed for that right now. So like, let's take a moment to like actually like be happy.
And that movie had an ice age literally coming like block by block. There were people running away from it.
That'd be really, really bad. But the bad news is we have missed 1.5 degrees C. And I don't know how to say this any more clearly, because there are people that will tell you that we might hit it. The odds of that are minuscule.
You can still torture a model to get the model to show show us hitting it.
The carbon budget, the remaining budget, the most recent papers, like from last month, say that the carbon budget to have a 50-50 shot of staying below 1.5 C is about 250 gigatons. Okay? We're emitting about 50 gigatons of carbon per year. So that's 5 years of emissions. Or if we smoothly went from 2022's numbers to zero in 10 years, by 2032, we'd have about a 50-50 chance of staying below 1.5. That ain't gonna happen, okay? Like, it's just not a thing. Now, the good news is, to stay below 2 degrees C, it's about 1 trillion tons. So that's about 40 years of emissions. So that's about, a little over 20 years of emissions. If we had 40 years to reach zero, you have a 50% chance of staying below 2 degrees C. That's a stretch, 2062, but it's not impossible.
It's a stretch. Yes.
And 2.5 degrees C is more than 2 trillion tons. So that, if you like smooth out from today to net zero in 2100, you'd have a 50-50 chance, the models tell us, of staying below 2.5 degrees C. And that is totally achievable. So that's the good news. Okay, what's the bad news? So first, like at 1.5 degrees C, the world does not end. It doesn't end at 1.6 degrees C, but every tenth of a degree matters. And right now, for instance, most recent papers say that every coral reef on Earth above 1.5 degrees C will experiencing bleaching events more rapidly than they can recover from. They won't all die on day one, but like they'll just enter a period of like permanent decline. Now the planet's going to be fine. After the last mass extinction event, it took about 4 million years to recover biodiversity in the oceans. That's nothing to the planet, but it's forever for human civilization. So our children and their children will not live in a place of such abundance. Okay, so what can you do? I've started to say that there's 3 things we have to do on climate. Number 1 is build. That's a lot of what we just talked about. Getting out of the way of permitting, having more policies to build stuff, so on. Number 2 is help nature adapt. And I'm going to say the things that are like my most provocative things. Maybe you're not going to like me after this, but I'll just call it how I see it. There is no such thing as wilderness on planet Earth anymore. We have modified the climate such that if it's a forest, if it's a coral reef, if it's a wetlands, it doesn't exist in the same climatic band that natural ecosystem evolved in. And so if you want to preserve those, we have to actively manage every so-called wild ecosystem on Earth, whether that's a rainforests or a forest in the Northwest or in Canada or in the tundra or things like coral reefs. And there's ways we can do that, but we have to get off of this naturalistic fallacy of like, we should just leave nature alone. You leave nature alone, it's going to die. Right? The only way to do this is we know there's some coral species that do better in high temperatures and acidity. Nobody wants to genetically engineer them, but you could be selectively breeding coral species for maximum survival rates in high temperature and helping these coral reefs adapt so that they can survive. So that's one. And then the next one, which is the even more controversial one, is we've already geoengineered the planet. We just have. We've done it accidentally through carbon emissions. And we've also done it by things like when people talk about solar radiation management, the scary kind of geoengineering, what we're talking about is reflecting more sunlight into space, cloud brightening, or injecting aerosols into the stratosphere to reflect a tiny bit of sunshine back into space. Nobody wants to do that, okay? But let's be clear, we're already doing that and we're undoing it unintentionally. Today, if you look at IPCC's numbers, all greenhouse gases account for about 3 watts per square meter of warming. That's human activity. The sulfur aerosols we're already emitting from ship fuels, from diesel engines, from coal plants, low altitude, they cause acid rain and other nasty stuff. That's about 1 watt per square meter of cooling It's already a solar shield with huge error bars, bigger error bars than greenhouse gases. And guess what? We're undoing that. In 2000, the International Maritime Organization, new IMO regulations went in that reduce the sulfur content of ships. And that means that we're in for this bonus warming, where we're undoing our solar shade, and we're going to have more warming happening. You see it. You can see from satellites shipping lanes having less reflection and more sunlight being captured.
Yes, this is an irony that is not well understood in the public, I think, is that by cleaning up air pollution, we are pretty radically accelerating warming.
Yeah. So James Hansen, and James is a little bit of a radical scientist. He's got a paper out, and he's really, really worried about unforeseen bonus warming as we cut these sulfur aerosols. So does that mean we just start injecting some into the stratosphere? No. What we got to do some science. So last year, before the IRA, the world spent about $1.1 trillion on climate tech. 1.4 if you ask the IEA. That's 1 times 10 to the ninth. The total budget for all science into solar radiation management has been about $10 million, right? 1 times 10 to the seventh, right? Sorry, I think I've got a factor of 3 off there. But 10 to the 12th versus 10 to the 7th. So that's 1/100,000th as much we spend on just doing computer modeling and small experiments. And so I'm a modest man. I don't think we should spend a lot of money on this, but let's spend $1 billion a year. That's nothing. Americans spend $4 billion a year on shampoo. So $1 billion is not much. It's like chump change. $1 billion in climate gets you nothing. But let's spend a small amount, $1 billion a year, on actually doing the science. Better computer models, more compute time, more funding for scientists, platforms that have sensors. When the next volcanic eruption happens, it sends stratospheric aerosols up. We can send LIDAR and spectrography and so on through them and see what happens. And some small controlled experiments, tiny ones, to actually see how this works, just to know, do we have this tool in our toolbox so that we could deploy it if the Arctic starts to warm exceptionally fast. We have uncontrolled methane release. And if we're not doing that, I think that's criminal. And that is the single biggest problem that we have in climate tech, the single biggest omission that we have in our climate plans today.
Oh, yes. Okay, so we're done, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thanks. Give money to Canary.
Thanks, David.
That's going to do it for the show. Stay tuned at the end of the credits for a special interview with CorePower CEO Lindsay Gorel on the future of battery storage. Again, you heard David Roberts and Ramez Nam just now. You can find both of those guys on Twitter. You can find David at volts.wtf. And this episode was produced by the Canary Media team and written by me. The Carbon Copy is a co-production of Postscript Media and Canary Media. Sean Marquand is our engineer, and original music came from Sean Marquand, who wrote our theme song, and from Echo Finch and Blue Dot Sessions. Postscript Media is supported by Prelude Ventures, and Prelude is a venture capital firm with a wide portfolio across energy, food and agriculture, transportation, logistics, advanced materials, manufacturing, and advanced computing. And hook us up with a rating and review of this podcast if you like it, and send your thoughts on social media. And we'll catch you next time. Thanks for being here. I'm Stephen Lacey. This is The Carbon Copy. We are building a battery-powered world. From mobility to the grid, batteries are being placed in everything around us. But America doesn't make many of those batteries. CorePower is a U.S. manufacturer making battery cells, energy storage systems, and asset management systems for a wide range of applications. Lindsay Gorel is CorePower's founder and CEO.
There's a lot of really good innovation in the United States right now and in North America on new electric boats or underground mining to electric systems or cool EVs and electric or three-wheelers and that kind of stuff that aren't getting any support from the big companies because they're focused with the big OEMs. And so we are focused really on that sector and the EV side because if you don't focus on that sector, the sector will die.
CorePower is also building solutions for stationary storage on the grid, a market that's grown almost 1,800% in the last 5 years, according to Wood Mackenzie.
We're focused heavily on both utility grid, energy storage, C&I, support to the grid, support to EV charging. So that's a big piece of us too. So we're kind of EV charging, energy storage, and also kind of tier 2, tier 3 EV companies.
I spoke with Lindsay about Core Power's plans to ramp up the Coreplex Gigafactory in Arizona, where the company is building a US-centric battery ecosystem.
We are producing what's called NMC technology, cell manufacturing, and LFP. So over 90% of the lithium cells in the world are under both those chemistries, and we have both. So we can produce any cell that we want for any industry.
So you recently announced a fundraise, $75 million, that will go toward building the Gigafactory that is underway right now in Arizona. Talk about the capital needs for that facility and the timeline for building out that facility.
Sure. We're excited that we broke ground or started moving dirt about 5 months ago. We'll be in production with the first 6 gigawatt hours of cell manufacturing in 2025, and the second phase of 9 gigawatt hours online by 2026. So we are targeting a total demand of 15 gigawatt hours of manufacturing of the Coreplex by 26, but we believe, based on the market demand and what's going on now, that we'll grow even bigger than that after 2026 by building additional manufacturing lines. The cost of the Coreplex is around $1 billion. And we're just finalizing. We've got quite a bit of funding already. We're finalizing the rest of the funding over this year.
And why Arizona?
I think once we looked at all the different states, at the end of the day, Arizona fit the bill on a couple of different things. One, all the states we looked at had the infrastructure. Once the infrastructure was done, you knew you could build it. What we like is dry and hot for cell manufacturing. And then by looking at where we are in Buckeye, Arizona, for logistics, it's really good to get to the port on the West Coast to ship overseas, but also employment. It was one of the fastest growing cities in America, had a lot of good schools, has got community colleges, has great universities, has great tech schools. So we saw our ability that if we built there, because all the infrastructure was there, we think we could help build an excited, basically, employment group of young people to join our company.
What is the hardest piece of building a company like Core Power?
That's a really good question. My background in the supply chain has helped me quite a bit because I understand the issues on supply. And so I've been working very hard with a number of companies. Looking ahead, I'm now a fully integrated solution company, but I need to get there by making sure I control my supply chain, right? So even though a lot of the stuff we're working on is bigger than just us, obviously bigger for the United States, but that's huge. And then the other side of it is employment. What I really want to do is I want to have these young students coming through high school and understanding who we are, that we're advanced manufacturing, that we're green energy, and we want to be involved in going to these high schools and going to these tech schools and teaching them about the industry, and we want them excited to come to the industry. So I think it's twofold, right? One is the whole thing about supplying the ability to build what you want to build, and that's one we worked on that. The other side is building and trying to help young people to be excited about the industry and want to come into this industry and see this as the next generation of the world. Come in, let's help the world, let's help the United States become green. I think those are the two things I would say that we focused on a lot in the last, and we're still focused on it.
Again, Lindsay Gorel is the founder and CEO of Core Power. To learn more about Core Power's investments in American industry and workers, go to corepower.com/carbon copy. That's KOREpower.com/carbon copy.